get us started. So tonight's session is one of a few different free options that we offer through Manhattan Prep. If you are looking for additional resources for some free LSAT studying, one of the things that you can do is try one of our classes. I think it's a really cool opportunity. Our session ones are 3 hours long, and they introduce you to logical reasoning and logic games. And you can attend a session 1 for free. We have them located in most major cities as well as online. And then we also have a really awesome interactive LSAT program called LSAT Interact. And this is kind of the closest thing that you can get to being part of a live class without actually being in a live class. It's an interactive video series that covers our complete LSAT curriculum. And each of the series includes both a lesson and practice problems that you do, and you put in your answers to the practice problems, and it provides you with adaptive feedback. So it'll say, oh, great job, you got that one right. Do you want to review it? Or it'll say, you know, you missed that one. Let's go over it together. And those lessons are taught by our LSAT instructors. So you can try some of those for free through our website. So the link is there if you're interested in checking those out. Our lesson today is going to focus on reading comprehension. And we're going to be doing a passage and a set of questions together. It'll be from the practice test 68, a real released practice test. And what we're going to focus on is a particular skill that can help you with a wide range of reading comprehension questions, and that is predicting. So we're going to talk about how on everything from main idea questions to inference questions and detail questions, making a prediction before you look at the answer choices can boost your accuracy and your efficiency on reading comprehension. We're going to start by reading a passage. So I'm going to put up a passage in just a moment, and I'm going to give you about 3.5 minutes to read that passage. I would encourage you during this time to take notes in whatever way you usually do in your studying and whatever way you're planning to take them on the actual test. And then once you've done, once you've finished reading the passage, I'll pop back up and let you know that time is up. And I'll go over the passage with you and talk about how I might have taken notes on this passage. So when the passage comes up, I'm going to hop off the camera so you don't feel like you're being watched while you read, but I'm still here, still listening, still watching the chat if you need anything. And I'll be back in 3.5 minutes to see how the passage went. Here it is. is about 3.5 minutes. I'm going to ask you now for two things. First, in the chat window, I ask you to rate your current understanding of this passage on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being you feel you have very high comprehension of this passage or somewhere in between. This will just give me a sense of where we're at with this passage. Okay, this is helpful feedback. Thank you, everybody. It looks like our responses are falling on the spectrum from this is a pretty difficult passage to kind of more of a moderate passage. And that is helpful, Katie. I think that makes a lot of sense that you know how the kind of the big picture of the passage, but the details about the theory, which isn't actually necessarily one thing that I'll point out about reading comprehension is that because you're reading under a lot of time pressure, it would actually be pretty unusual for someone to walk out of a passage saying, my comprehension is a 10 out of 10. And it would be just difficult for anybody to achieve that in such a short amount of time, and might actually not even be the right goal. If we are aiming for a 10 out of 10 comprehension, that might slow us down so much that we don't end up having a lot of time for the questions. So our goal for comprehension is more to figure out what is the big picture of this passage. And in particular, there's two major things that I'm looking for when I do my initial read of the passage. The first thing that I'm looking for is to get a map of the big ideas of the passage. In particular, what are the viewpoints, especially the author's opinion. And then the second thing that I want to get is the passage map. So I want to understand the big opinions that are presented or the big ideas. And then I want to have kind of a general sense of the layout of this passage so that if I needed to find some details, I would know where to look. I do not have to have a 10 out of 10 comprehension of all of the details of the passage. So there might be some aspects that feel a little bit fuzzy to me watching the passage, and that's okay because I can always revisit those when I'm working through the questions. So I'm going to talk you through the things that I paid attention to when I read this passage for the first time. I will be honest that economics is not my forte. I didn't really study anything business related in college. And so I empathize with those of you who are saying this passage feels kind of challenging. For me, just not having a ton of background information on this does make it feel a bit challenging as well. So here's what I paid attention to. I kind of go paragraph by paragraph. And as I read each paragraph, I'm looking for those major viewpoints, and I'm thinking about how this paragraph is laid out. So in the first paragraph, I'm told that we have a particular book, and it's attributed to David Warsh. So I might jot down DW because this is a person who's going to have a particular viewpoint. And David Warsh is sharing that there is this contradiction, and the contradiction is in Adam Smith's book, and it is in particular the struggle between the pin factory, so I'm going to put PF, versus the invisible hand. So at this point, I'm noting this because it seems to be the framework for the overall passage. It's sort of setting up a central question for me, which is what is the conflict between the pin factory and the invisible hand, and how might it be resolved, or what does the author think about that contradiction? Having that sort of overarching question and noticing the duality in this passage is a really helpful strategy for reading comp in general. Most reading comprehension passages are set up so that there is some sort of debate, duality, or tension that is being explored in the passage. I put my finger on what that is and how the author feels about it. So here I'm framing it as, okay, pin factory versus invisible hand. What is this contradiction all about? And what does the author have to say about it? So that's what I'm wondering as I move into the second paragraph. In the second paragraph, they tell me that using the example of a pin factory, Smith emphasizes this particular idea. Here I get a new viewpoint and a person that it's attributed to. So I get Adam Smith's viewpoint. And this is something that I do want to slow down to understand. So Adam Smith is saying that you would have huge increases in efficiency through increased size. So I'm going to slow down and read that if I need to, and I'm going to jot down what I take away from this. If you increase size, that leads to an increase in efficiency, and it is framed through pin factory versus invisible hand. I'm going to make a note that this is associated with the pin factory as an example. Then the passage gives a little bit of additional explanation, which I'm going to read but not necessarily write down. This is explaining to me a little bit more about how these increases in efficiency can be achieved, telling me these employees could produce far more by specializing. Then we get this shift into a different idea. So now Smith is, or the author is talking about how Smith recognizes how a market economy can harness self-interest to the common good and ties this back to the invisible hand. So I've got a second major idea I want to note. I've got the pin factory, and then I've got this invisible hand idea, which is that the economy harnesses self-interest for the common good. The passage then elaborates on this, and I might use this example to help bolster my own understanding of the big idea, but I'm not going to slow down and make sure that I have 100% comprehension of this example. What I really want to focus on is having a strong comprehension of the big viewpoints that have been mentioned in this passage. I'm also paying attention to the structure and kind of mapping this as I go. So far, I'm noticing, okay, the first paragraph set up kind of an introduction to what this contradiction is. The second paragraph seems to explain sort of the major idea on each side of the contradiction. Here's what the idea is of the pin factory, and here's what the idea is of the invisible hand. And it gives examples of each. So I'm kind of tracking this so that I know where to look when I'm asked questions. So moving into the third paragraph, I get a pretty clear topic sentence telling me that this paragraph is going to explain how these concepts are contradictory to each other. So that's important. That's the central question that I'm trying to answer in this passage. So I'm going to make sure that I slow down a bit and try to understand how this is a contradiction. I don't know about you, but I had to kind of read this paragraph through and pause to think about it before it really started to make sense. And what I saw by the time I had gotten through the end of the paragraph was they're creating this opposition around the idea of competitors. So first we talk about the pin factory, which tends to lead to a monopoly or having one business that kind of outcompetes everyone else. And the smaller firms are driven out of business. On the other hand, the invisible hand theory relies on the idea of there being a lot of competitors. So it doesn't really seem like these two economic principles can both function at the same time. In fact, they are saying the invisible hand theory relies on sort of an opposite economic theory, that your returns to scale, or what you get in terms of profits as you increase your size, is actually diminishing or increasing, which is the opposite of the pin factory theory. So I might not have 100% comprehension of that idea, but I have a start. So I can jot down, okay, so the pin factory tends to lead towards monopoly, and the invisible hand relies on there being lots of competitors. So we have this inherent contradiction between these two theories. Then I'm going to move into the fourth paragraph. And the fourth paragraph, again, has a pretty clear topic sentence. It tells me this assumption of diminishing returns dominated economic theory with pin factory de-emphasized, and asked why. Now, I might not have totally grasped diminishing returns, but I see that they're saying the pin factory was de-emphasized. So that must mean that this diminishing returns idea goes along with the invisible hand theory, which is kind of the opposite of the pin factory. So the invisible hand theory with its diminishing returns dominates economic theory. Pin factory doesn't, and then they're going to explain why. And so I'm going to read to figure out why. And they tell me this has to do with math and the ability of economists to express these economic theories with math rigorously and clearly. And the P factors are to represent mathematically. Moving into the fourth paragraph, I'm anticipating that I'm going to find out a little bit more about maybe how the author feels about this or how this contradiction has been resolved. So I get this idea that the economists have been trying to bring the pin factory idea into economic thoughts, sort of mainstream. I'm going to highlight many economists as another viewpoint. And I get this shift since the late 1970s. This has now sort of become part of mainstream economic thought because they have found ways to rigorously describe it. So at the end of the passage, I'm getting pin factory is kind of now part of the mainstream because they found rigorous mathematical representations. So this is how I would track the passage as I read, and this is what I would focus on. And I'm noting as I go that there are areas where I feel like my comprehension is not that strong, and I'm making sure that my comprehension of the big ideas is pretty strong. And that self-awareness is really good. So Katie, when you mentioned these are the things that made sense to me and these are the things that didn't, that's excellent, because when you move into the questions, if you know that something didn't really make sense to you, then you know you might need to slow down and approach that question with a little bit more care. Or alternatively, if you're in a position where you might need to skip a question for the sake of time, you might skip one of those questions that you know didn't make a ton of sense. Yeah, exactly. We are thinking the same thing. I'm going to share with you just kind of a template for how I think about the passage map as I go through. So I'm thinking about what is the sort of central question of the passage? What is that tension or duality or debate that's going on here? In this case, it's the invisible hand versus the pin factory. Why do they contradict? And how is that contradiction resolved? And then as I'm going through the passage, you'll see 5 numbers here, and those represent the 5 paragraphs. So I want to have a general grasp of 2 things. For each paragraph, I want to know kind of its purpose, or maybe a function is the better word, within the passage as a whole. And then also, what are the big ideas of that paragraph? For example, I might label paragraph 1 as introductory material, and then note the big ideas are that there's a struggle between the pin factory and the invisible hand. And I would go on to do this for each of the remaining 5 paragraphs. All right. Let me check out. Looks like there's a comment or a question. Yeah, Katie, and that the author agrees. Excellent. All right, I am going to move us now into talking about the main focus of our lesson today, which is actually more about how to approach the questions. So the big thing to emphasize today is how useful prediction can be as a tool in reading comprehension. So there are 4 steps that I generally go through with reading comprehension questions. I read the question itself first, and then I immediately revisit the text, looking for support to help guide my thinking on what the correct answer should be. I make a prediction, which I may or may not actually jot down or just form in my head. And then I eliminate with my prediction in mind. And the bulk of my work actually happens in these first 3 steps. And I think that's a really important process change for many people. What often happens on reading comprehension is folks read the question and immediately dive into the answer choices and start trying to eliminate answer choices and looking for answer choices that they like. And the challenge when you do that is that the LSAT is really good at writing answer choices that you are going to like. So if you go into the answer choices without a clear sense of direction and a clear sense of what you're looking for, you're going to see a lot of things that look pretty good and spend a lot of time trying to verify those answers and possibly talk yourself into the wrong answer. So I think of making a prediction as kind of having an anchor that I'm going to refer to over and over again. That's going to kind of make sure that I stay focused as I go through the answer choices and don't get distracted by wrong answers that look very tempting. So in order to help us practice this process, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to give you just the question at first. And so you're not even going to see the answer choices. And you can see here I've got question number 15 for this passage right here in the box. No answer choices. I will give you the answer choices in a minute, but first I just want you to make a prediction based on your understanding of the passage, your passage map, and any references to the text, so that you have a strong anchor going into these answer choices. So I'm going to give you a minute right now to jot down a prediction. If you'd like, you can share it in the chat window, and then we'll talk about our predictions and how they map onto the answer choices. So again, I'm going to hop off the camera, make a prediction for how you would answer this question. And if you'd like, you can share your prediction in the chat window. Okay, when you have your prediction ready, feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat window. And I'm going to share the prediction that I created and how I came up with it. So I did the same exercise as I was working through this passage. I looked at the question, I didn't look at the answer choices, and I formed a prediction, and I actually jotted it down to kind of guide me through the answer choices. When I'm trying to predict what the main point of a passage is, there are 2 things that I focus on. I focus on the author's opinion, and I focus on the overall map of the passage. I want my prediction to be pretty comprehensive of the ideas that are expressed in this passage from beginning to end. And I want to make sure that if the author came down on a certain side, that I express that. So looking back at this passage, I start with, okay, so the main point is we've got this contradiction according to David Warsh's book. So put EW, there's a contradiction between Pin Factory and Invisible Hand. And the passage goes on to explain why, that it's basically because of different assumptions about competition that each of those theories makes. And then it goes on to say that basically the Pin Factory theory was ignored for a while by economists until the 1970s, when economists found the rigor, the mathematical rigor that they needed to embrace pin factory, or the pin factory idea. Awesome. Cool. Thank you, Katie. That's a great prediction. So I made this prediction without any idea of what the answer choices said, but I feel pretty confident that it represents the big ideas of the passage and that it's pretty comprehensive. So I'm going to take that prediction now, and I'd like for y'all to take your predictions. You can help guide me through the answer choices. I will move this out of the way and change the color. Okay, and I'll give you about a minute now to use your prediction, and I want you to eliminate answer choices that don't align with it. And when you have an answer, I'm going to put up a poll in just a minute to see which answer you think is best. Okay, it's been about a minute, so I'm going to put up a poll, and it's going to give you the option to choose which answer you would select if you had to make a decision right now. It's okay if you're not 100% certain, but I would love it if you could let me know what you would choose at this moment. Awesome, thank you. Okay. So my prediction over here, it's a little bit easier to see. I'm going to talk through these answer choices and how I would evaluate them based on my prediction. So I'm looking for the main point of the passage. I want this to be something that is both comprehensive and accurate. Seth, I'm sorry. The passage goes away when I put the question up. So that's why we keep it up when you're making a prediction. For this main idea, for a main idea question, we actually don't spend a lot of time referring to the passage itself, but instead more to our notes and our passage map. So this is how the lesson will work. The passage will be there when you're making your prediction, but then it's going to go away when I show the question in full, partly because I just can't fit everything on the screen. So for the next one, if you could jot down your prediction when you see the passage and the question so that you can use it to guide you through the answer choices. All right, so thinking about the main point of the passage, again, I'm looking for something that expresses this idea that there's a contradiction between the pin factory and the invisible hand, that was due to competition, and that the pin factory was ignored until the 1970s. So we'll start with answer choice A. Mainstream economists have always assumed that returns to scale are generally increasing rather than decreasing. This seems pretty different from my prediction. It seems a lot more specific. I do remember them talking about returns to scale, but that's not the big idea that I anticipated. So I'm going to cross this one off. Answer choice B, the functioning of the invisible hand is accepted primarily because diminishing returns can be described with mathematical rigor. So again, this is something that is kind of described in the passage, this idea of the invisible hand, and the fact that it's accepted because of mathematical rigor. But it doesn't quite map onto my predicted answer that this is going to focus on the contradiction, that this pin factory idea was ignored until the 1970s. I'm going to rule this one out. C says recent developments in math have enabled the pin factory to be modeled even more rigorously than the invisible hand. This is getting a bit closer. So I see here this connection between the pin factory and the invisible hand. But what I notice about this one is that it's describing this comparison where the pin factory is modeled more rigorously than the invisible hand. And that comparison wasn't really the emphasis of the passage, that one is modeled better than the other. In fact, they focused a lot in the passage on how the invisible hand was modeled more rigorously at first than the pin factory. So I'm going to cross this one off. Adam Smith was the first economist to understand how a market economy can enable individual self-interest to serve the common good. So here I've got an expression of one of the big ideas, the invisible hand, and an emphasis on Adam Smith, who was really part of the one. So hopefully he is the correct answer. Economists have, until somewhat recently, failed to account for the increasing returns to scale common to many industries. So this at first seems like it leaves out some of the things I'm looking for. Like I don't see an explicit mention of pin factory or the invisible hand. But what I do see is this idea that this was ignored. The economists have failed to account for it. Until somewhat recently. So I get this more comprehensive view of what's happened in the thinking of economists, that they used to think one way, but now they think another way. So it captures the change in the passage. And then this increasing returns to scale, common in many industries, is code for the pin factory model. So I'm going to select E, because it covers sort of the comprehensive view of this passage of the shift that occurred throughout the passage. Katie, good observation. So the word always is also a pretty extreme word that could make us question an answer choice. Okay, let me know if you have any questions about this one. If not, we're going to move on to the next question. So this question, I'm going to pass up while you have the questions down here, and then the passage will go away when I present the full question. So I'd like for you to use this time to make a prediction based on this question stem. I'll give you about 2 minutes to do that. Okay, Katie, thanks for sharing that. So she mentioned it's kind of hard to know how to predict this. So let's talk about what you might do in this situation. This is an author's attitude question. So when we're trying to predict an author's attitude, we're trying to focus on how does the author feel or what does the author think about this idea. So I agree that the language at the end as one of it's a little hard to know where they're going to go with that, but I'm going to focus on the content of this stimulus. So I'm looking for the author's attitude towards this idea that the pin factory model should be part of mainstream economic thought. Whenever I'm asked about the author's attitude towards something, I start by just thinking, does the author agree or disagree with this idea? Does the author feel positively or negatively towards it? What do y'all think? Is the author in favor of this idea that the pin factory model should be part of mainstream economic thought? Tell me in the chat, do you think the author would agree with that or disagree? Cool. I'm seeing a lot of people say that they think the author agrees. So my prediction on a question like this might just start as maybe the word positive or negative or the word agree or disagree. So we're thinking the author feels positively towards this idea, agrees with this idea. I'm going to switch now to the page with the answer choices. And keeping in mind that we said that we anticipate that the author agrees with this idea or feels positively about it, take a moment to read the answer choices and decide which one you think best reflects that. Okay, I'm going to share a poll. Okay, so it looks like everybody's settling on answer choice E, and I would agree with that. The answer choice E is the most positive answer choice. Hostility is outright negative disagreement. Difference would suggest the author doesn't care. Curious is just kind of the wrong word for this situation. It doesn't express enough of an opinion. If we have to decide between whether the author is uncertain about this or receptive to it, I would go with receptive. The author takes a lot of time to explain why this prevailing trend towards including the invisible hand in economic theory is kind of a contradiction and is leaving something out. So the author seems to be in favor of reconciling that contradiction and finding a way to account for the pin factory model. Katie mentioned an important point, which is that the passage talks about the rigor of the pin factory model and says, you know, that maybe the pin factory model shouldn't be fully accepted until it can be rigorously proven, which might lean someone, make someone want to choose maybe answer B. So let's look back at that idea. So in the passage, we see the idea of rigor come up right around here in line 40. And I noticed that it ascribes this to economists, saying economists have always sought the rigor and clarity that comes from representing their ideas. So what's important about this is that the author themselves is not owning this idea. saying this is what economists think, and this is why economists have left the pin factory out of their mainstream economic theory. That doesn't mean that the author feels that way or that the author is uncertain about the pin factory theory. The author is just kind of trying to explain why economists think the way they do and have left this out. So based off of that, I would choose answer E. Let me know if you have any questions. And if not, let's try this exercise again. This time we've got a purpose of a paragraph question. So your goal is going to be to revisit the fourth paragraph and predict what you think the purpose of that paragraph is. And I'll pause for a moment and give you some time to do that. Okay, if you'd like to, feel free to share your answer in the chat. I see Katie's got a good one rolling in, elaborating on one of the theories that is being contradicted and why this theory isn't accepted yet. I think that's a great prediction. So we have that really clear topic sentence that says the pin factory has been de-emphasized. Why? So it seems pretty clear that the goal of this paragraph is to explain why the pin factory theory has been de-emphasized, with a particular emphasis on the idea that increasing returns, as it describes at the end, are hard to represent mathematically. Hard to represent with math. All right, so I'm going to take that prediction and I'm going to move into the question with this in mind. Take a moment to read the question and figure out which answer choice you would select. Okay, I'm going to send out another poll. Let me know what you're thinking. That's okay. No worries, Bob. All right, thanks. So it looks like we are split between A, B, and C. So let's talk through it. So again, my prediction was this paragraph is meant to explain why the pin factory theory was de-emphasized, and that had to do with representing it in math, and that was hard. Increasing returns were hard to represent with math. So let's go through these. Answer choice A says critique a theory purporting means trying or saying that it does, to resolve the tensions between two economic assumptions. So this is kind of almost making it sound like there's three theories. We've got the two economic assumptions in the pin factory and the invisible hand, and then it's making it sound like there's another theory that tries to resolve those two theories, and that theory is being critiqued. And I think that's one too many theories for this passage. We really just have the two theories, and we're talking throughout the passage about how to resolve this apparent contradiction between them. So I'm going to cross this one off for that reason. Answer choice B, explain a difficulty associated with modeling a particular economic assumption. That does sound pretty accurate to my prediction, because my prediction was it has to do with how hard it is to turn this into math. And it is focused on a particular economic idea of the pin factory. So I'm gonna, and I'd even said that this was sort of explaining something. So I'm gonna keep this answer in. C says outline the intuitions supporting a particular economic assumption. I don't know that the word intuitions accurately describes the focus of this paragraph, which was more about how do we represent these two different theories with math, not necessarily with intuition. So I'm going to cross this one off. D says describe the tensions resulting from attempts to model two competing economic assumptions. I don't think anyone chose this answer. Tension seems a little bit off here, as well as this idea of attempting to model two competing economic assumptions. The paragraph is more focused on just, it was hard to do this at all for pin factory. So I'm going to cross this off. And then E, refute an argument against a particular economic assumption is pretty far off from my prediction. So I'm going to choose the answer that was the closest to my prediction, which is answer choice B, and that's the correct answer for the LSAT. Let me know if you have any questions here. If not, let's take a look at what will probably be our final question. Take a moment to make a prediction for this one. I'll give you a little bit of context first. So if we read this question, it can be inferred from the passage that the pin factory model would continue to be an underground river were it not for. This feels a little bit like a question that might be hard to predict because of that ending, but I'm going to focus on what I understand, which is the pin factory model would still be an underground river. And I'm going to rephrase this ending part and kind of say like, if not for. So in other words, I'm trying to explore why did it stop being an underground river? Like what is a causal factor of whether or not it was an underground river, or what is something that maybe would have influenced that? So I'm going to give you a minute to revisit the text and look for how does the passage explain why the pin factory is no longer an underground river. All right, so Katie's got a great prediction coming in again. So this is an idea that might have been a little tricky on the first pass through, so I'm going to revisit it. I see the term underground river here, they point me to it. And they say it kind of was an underground river and now it's surfaced into the mainstream. So I'm thinking underground river must mean like people weren't really paying attention to it, or it wasn't kind of visible in the economic community, but now it's in the mainstream. And they tell me why. It's because economists found ways to describe this with the rigor needed to make it respectable. So my prediction for this one was basically just the word rigor. If they hadn't found this rigorous way to model the pin factory theory, then they probably would still not be paying attention to it. It would still be that underground river. So let's take that prediction and apply it to some answer choices. Take a look. Okay, go ahead and choose an answer when you're ready. All right, nice. So I'm seeing some pretty clear consensus around the answer choice C, which is the only one that matches our prediction that this was reliant on rigor. So nice work. So we're gonna wrap up our lesson here. I'm gonna take a moment to kind of review the big ideas. So the big thing that I'm hoping that everybody gets out of this lesson is that it is worthwhile to do some investigating in the text and anticipating of the answer before you start going through the answer choices. We've seen on, I'd say, 2 of the 4 questions that we did that our predictions were really spot on, enabled us to very quickly hone in on what the correct answer was, which saves us a lot of time for some of the more challenging questions. And we've also seen how on those more complex questions, having a solid prediction can guide you through some of the more tempting incorrect answer choices. So I'd encourage you to think about what you might like to change about the way that you approach reading comprehension based on what we worked on today. If you think prediction is something that might be helpful to you, that might improve your accuracy or your speed, one way that you can practice this is just by covering up answer choices on reading comprehension passages until you have made a prediction. All right, if you'd like to get a little bit more exposure to our resources, you can check out our upcoming courses on our website. Remember that you can try the first session of any one of our courses for free. And this is where I'm going to part ways with